Okay, so good morning, Peter. Thank you for joining me this morning with Restore Our Planet. And yeah, so just to kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your um, and what you've been up to in conservation and what inspires you? And yeah, go ahead.
Well, good morning. So my background's quite interesting. So originally I studied medical biochemistry of all things, but I was always interested in evolutionary genetics. That's really been one of my things, and ecology. So, I was quite a green student and I wanted to make a difference, as we all do, as many of us do. We really wanted to make a difference. So I then went on to be one of the first graduates from the Durrell Institute of Conservation Ecology in their master's program. I was very fortunate to get a grant to go there. A young working class lad in a sea of, um,
Posh boys.
high-end academia, posh boys, funding themselves. But I just fell on my feet. But I suppose having somebody with such a very a mathematical education. So I did computer modeling and I did genetics and I did a lot of studies on minimum viable population sizes, how genes survive in small populations. So I was doing Monte Carlo simulations, and basically the stuff I was studying was it just wasn't in all those ecologists. It was well beyond their level, and I had to be an entrepreneur to do the work I wanted to do, and that's essentially what I've been. I've been an entrepreneur for wildlife, and I've thought broadly. So then I went and worked for Scottish Wildlife Trust and some of the other wildlife trusts, and I started fundraising, and I found I was quite good at fundraising and managing membership systems and all that. So I went on to I got an MA in marketing and I've got an MBA as well. So I'm a real nerd, collected lots of qualifications and did things properly. So I was probably the most successful fundraiser in the wildlife trusts movement, raised them many tens of millions of pounds with various mad schemes. And then I set up Wildwood Trust, which was because there was no rewilding charity then. We're talking 20 years ago. So at Kent Wildlife Trust, I did the Beaver project with the fantastic John McAllister, who is often not mentioned, but the person who is most responsible for that early program was John McAllister, and we became thick as thieves putting together I suppose Britain's first rewilding project. In the early rewilding, we went over to Europe and found out about what they were doing in rewilding. So we were very avant-garde, and we managed to get money to fund it. And this is where your story meets mine, is 20 years ago when your wonderful charity was first set up. One of your bosses phoned me up and said, "We want to fund some projects. Have you got anything for us to do?" And I mentioned the Beaver project, and lo and behold, they helped fund that. So
Fantastic.
it was very early days, and we were very avant-garde. A lot of people didn't want to do it. It was dangerous.
And Peter, you just touched there on wilding or rewilding,
Mm.
as we're about to get into. Exactly how might we define those two terms
Well,
broadly?
we gotta. Nature's quite complicated, and we can talk about what wildlife is in a moment. But I think when we talk about rewilding, what we're essentially saying is once upon a time, before man interfered too much, although man's always had an influence in nature, nature essentially evolved itself and it maximized its own biodiversity. So leaving nature alone with all its processes, and they're very complicated, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but essentially rewilding just means we're going back to a state of high biodiversity without that much intervention from man. I think wildings come in because that natural human need to be in charge, which is anti-rewilding. So wilding is a kind of softened rewilding. So it allows certain conservation charities, certain groups to feel they are in charge. They are the progenitors of this process. So this wildlife is because they are actively wilding, while rewilding is saying let nature go free and stop interfering. Is that a good? Does that
No,
make
no,
sense?
absolutely, no, completely. Okay, and can you give us some examples of that you might know about perhaps certain parts of the UK or certain species in terms of give us an idea of the process, more of a
Okay, doc.
detailed level?
So rewilding is, I think, when you just look at a piece of land that's just been left alone for 30 years, right? You get some rewilding. There is, I've forgotten its name. There's a lovely study just came out a couple of weeks ago on that. They left a bit of farmland. The old MAF left a bit of farmland back in the 60s and they just let it go. And lo and behold, it's turned into land that's just like the nearby woodland with the same level of biodiversity. And you can see how the succession has gone on in that area. You've just created another habitat equal to that around it with no intervention from humans. I think there was some deer culling 20 years ago, but essentially they haven't done anything lately. And basically, the land is now species rich. But it doesn't have those natural processes where wilding, obviously you've got Nep Castle, I suppose, is the perfect example, but that's just a continuation of that process of understanding where if you lower the grazing and you leave the land alone, you get fantastic biodiversity. But having that slightly enhanced grazing by cows and deer and a few horses gives you more. My cat's running around, by the way. Um,
Sorry.
you have that slightly higher grazing, akin to what used to happen naturally, but you get a higher biodiversity out of it. So there's a good example where NEP is really good, but it's not the Białowieża in Poland. It is not a true, the level of biodiversity in the Białowieża, or what's happened at Chernobyl, where the rewilding there, which is totally self-willed, right? That's the word, the buzzword to use, self-willed, is actually higher, but you can get close to it with wilding, where you actually make a plan and start doing it.
Right. We should probably say that Nep is an estate in I forget which county
Sussex.
in Sussex, which is basically been
Yes.
used as a real sort of quite broad, so I think a few hundred hectares program for wilding
Yeah,
slash
it's
rewilding.
3,500 acres, I think.
3,500 acres.
Charlie Burrell, the chap who runs it, it's a fantastic. And then I think when we talk about the future of wildlife, we need to come back to understand the economics and the role that NEP plays in understanding how we can do it. So NEP's fantastic.
That's great. Okay, that leads us on nicely. So, how would we define wildlife in broad
So
terms?
wildlife, right? So this is something I've written academic papers on and studied biodiversity metrics and all the academic side of it. So essentially, you've got the birds and the bees, right? We've got creatures on one level, biodiversity, and you can. In the past, we've kind of classified biodiversity and conservation priorities looking for rare species. So we are going to look at the rarest birds, some of the rarest insects, the rarest flowers, and then we're going to spend our time managing that habitat to maintain those flowers, right? That's classical conservation. And you put all your effort into freezing ecology and looking at these rarities. So that's species biodiversity, right? And then you can look at it in a bit more and saying it's the interrelationship. So now we're moving on to ecology. So what is the interrelationship between different animals? So one thing, so we can talk about biodiversity being a species count, how many species, you can look at how many plants in an area, nature. But then you need to, as you study ecology, you learn much more about ecology, that it's about the water, it's about the subsoil, the soil, the microbes, the little bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi in the soil that is interrelated to the plants, that then gets interrelated to the insects that burrow into the soil and live on the plants, and then what feeds on them. And finally, you get to the big grazers above them. and the apex predators that all balance their nature. So we've got biodiversity and wildlife being a living, breathing, interrelated thing between all parts of nature. And then if we start getting even bigger than that, we can talk about wildlife being the abiotic factors, the air, all the oxygen in our atmosphere was created by life. It was created by bacteria. Mountains, how they put out carbon dioxide, how sediments go. And then you start getting into the Gaia side of things where you look at huge processes. So wildlife, life is all those things. So when we talk about life, we can't just talk about wildlife, the birds and the bees. We've got to talk about the sum total of everything.
So that's sort of James Lovelock's idea of Gaia,
Yes.
the Earth is like a single organism, or the movie Avatar, as some other people might.
I know, but that's where you
might see it.
You're using, in that way. I like metaphysics. I'm a big metaphysics fan. So we're using metaphysics to describe. We're using sort of religious concepts, spiritual concepts, to actually just describe a complex scientific process.
Greek in this case, of course. Yeah.
So I think that's where we're so people who don't study the science need to express what is plainly evident, but they do it in a spiritual manner. I'm a boring scientist, so I like to use science.
Could you speak a little bit more to the metaphysics of Gaia?
Well,
a little bit?
The metaphysics of, Lovelock, I was inspired as an 18-year-old by Lovelock's book. I read it when it first came out, and I read lots of scientific papers. And at the time, as an 18-year-old, I was really interested in how do we actually describe life. And I've actually got some scientific things I call Smith's first and second law, right? So what is life? Now, I can describe it in a scientific way, but you need to see it as a metaphysical way as well. So life is energy, right? That's the metaphysical way. It's a fundamental energy. But in a scientific way, what we see is the sun's energy and nuclear energy through the planet, geothermal energy, because we're only hot because of nuclear breakdown, fission inside the planet. Otherwise, we'd be a hard rock. Yeah. So that energy has now been trapped by a process that takes that energy and creates complexity, molecular bonds from it. And the way to describe that is negative entropy, right? And if I try to describe what entropy is to your audience, they might get a bit bored. But
entropy isn't it something similar to sort of disintegration or kind
yes
of
and no yes and no.
No?
So when I say negative entropy is the universal tendency to everything to disintegrate, right? The cold death of the universe in 20 trillion years. That's all. Everything dissociates into nothing. But if we take some energy, we can reverse that process of entropy, negative entropy, and we can create stability. And if we can measure all of the stability of all the bonds, right, between all the organic matter and how likely that organic matter is to survive in the future, that's informational negative entropy, we can then calculate what is life. And that's my own little thing, sitting in an organic chemistry lab when I was 18, trying to sum up. And then we've got evolution, the second law, my little second law. Evolution is the process of making that negative entropy more efficient. Okay.
It's a good project.
It's that's evolution. Now that's a way of seeing everything. Now in a metaphysical sense, we can go back and talk about it's all energy, man. Well, it is all energy. It's just learning. It's the processes. It's the old second law of thermodynamics. It's about understanding how energy is produced and preserved to create what is. So what's man doing at the moment? We're destroying that energy.
Okay, well that's again a nice little segue to so Peter, tell me a little bit about the state of wildlife in the UK. What's happened? What's going on with species loss? And
it's the curate's egg. There are some excellent work being done to save wildlife, and we're getting better at saving wildlife. People are learning, But of course, that's only on a tiny few places. And
For
most,
example, give us some examples there.
nature reserves,
Oh,
stuff like that,
places
right?
like Brown Sea Island, perhaps one, or up in the Cairngorms,
Yeah.
uh,
So we're managing
Exmoor,
certain types of land.
parts of
But
Kent. Yeah.
overall, we're losing wildlife. And that's because we're using the land more intensely. So we've got more commercial forestry, and we've got more pesticides, more machines managing the land, or we're using that land in ways that reduces biodiversity on it. So it's all land use, and land use economics is what as we've talked before, that's what I spend my time studying at the moment, is why do we choose to use that land and how that then affects wildlife. So overall, most of the scientific data, with notable exceptions, is going for a reduced biodiversity on the grand scale. So, the biomass of England is in Scotland and Wales is decreasing, but we've got notable exceptions where we've stopped hunting certain animals. So, we're seeing a rise in things like red kites, buzzards, sparrowhawks. We've got some better laws that stop the poisoning of certain animals, but overall, our rivers are generally deteriorating. Our land is generally deteriorating, with notable exceptions. And there we come to this problem where we're not slowing down in the reduction of biodiversity. It's still carrying on. All the efforts we're putting in to save rewilding are not halting the loss of wildlife. We're fighting against a tide of man's abuse of the land and water and air.
Yeah. Just on a sort of anecdotal level, I always remember growing up seeing stag beetles. So this is early 90s. Stag beetles absolutely everywhere. Don't see them anymore.
Yeah. And that's because we're not letting. So stag beetles, wonderful creatures, I love them. Watch out, they can give a good bite when they want to, especially the females. So their grubs like things like oak that's buried in the ground. So all of our efforts to manage land, to make it look tidy, is what's killing. Also, all the pesticides and the other crap we're throwing into the land. It's, even though some of those pesticides are not as bad as the ones we used to use, we're still using more of them. It's the tyranny of farm management, which is maximizing revenue, that puts this on, and it's our natural tendency to tidy things up is killing the stag beetle. So there's a perfect example. Now you can go and do a project yourself, bury some wood, bury some oak in the ground, and 20 years later you'll have some stag beetles there. But that's hard. You have to do that, and you can only do a little bit of it.
Something I read, which I think really resonate with a lot of people who don't quite understand the extent of what's actually happening, is that with the die-off of a lot of sort of beetles and butterflies and what we might sort of refer to as nice insects, you essentially get like the ecosystem gets replaced with cockroaches, flies, a lot more of the things that people are. Well,
yes. Invasive pest species,
the nasty
have
species.
When we mess around with the land, we destroy the balance of nature. So you get more, and that goes with plants, Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam. You've got rivers going for your signal crayfish instead of your white claw crayfish. We've got all these things where we've got invasive nasties that are ending up being not so nice to man, and we are losing that natural web of life that protects us. And we can see, and that affects rewilding as well, of course, because what happens when you start rewilding is often you get invasives, pioneer species coming in. So a lot of people think rewilding is rubbish. Some people are against rewilding because initially you don't get perfection, but if you wait a few years, you start getting magic.
Do you have some examples of where people can
My
see
front
that?
lawn. My front lawn. That's my lockdown project has been rewilding my front lawn, but many places where you start rewilding. So if you go up to a hill situation, you start getting purple ryegrass taking over when you stop grazing, and it's not until you get succession that you start getting rid of that. A perfect example of anybody who owns a horse. If you graze hard in an area and you pull the horses off. You'll start getting um, brain freeze. What's the word? Yellow flower.
Daisies,
No,
buttercups,
no, the one all the horsey people
dandelions.
hate. No, 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 no.
Oh goodness me!
Yeah. Anyway, brain goes. You start getting
It's okay.
some plants that can often be seen as dangerous and be almost like a monoculture. Okay,
Right.
until you get those natural processes, until the soil starts regenerating and has the diversity of the microbes. Because remember, a plant is not a plant is a symbiotic organism with many things in the soil around it. So you need all these processes to re-establish themselves to start getting back. So ragwort is the plant I was thinking
Ragwort,
of.
right.
So ragwort is hated by horsey people because people who don't manage their land properly will get a lot of ragwort. It spreads, but actually ragwort's a great plant. I mean, it is poisonous to horses in certain circumstances, but it's part of nature's mix. You often see it along the roadside verges where that roadside verges hasn't been married. It's been really mowed back by a contractor and then it's been left, and so you get these pioneer species. So that's a problem with rewilding, is learning you've got to push past the initial problems of re-establishing nature to get that diversity, and you have to reintroduce natural processes like a bit of grazing or a cutting regime to get nature coming back properly.
Okay. So oh, so obviously there's plenty of, or at least pockets of successful rewilding.
Mhm.
You said it's obviously quite a slow process, but you've painted quite a bleak picture there overall in terms
Yes,
of overall
because
UK wildlife. So what can be done on a sort of big enough scale to actually really make some meaningful impact?
you've got to understand what drives land use, right? Why does an individual landowner make the decisions they do? And some of those are to do with culture and knowledge. They know what they've done in the past, they know how to get it. But essentially, most decisions are economic ones. A land manager, a farmer, somebody who wants to invest into forestry, and that's going on loads at the moment. The amount of forestry going on because the government, they see a future where they'll get government subsidies over forestry. Even though I'm against commercial forestry for rewilding, it's not very good. It doesn't even suck in carbon because you lose carbon from the soil. You might grow a tree, but the soil itself will lose carbon. So it's all this stuff that growing commercial forests for carbon sequestration is garbage, and a lot of the science is starting to back that up. So what can we do? Well, my life's journey has been trying to answer that question. How do we change the direction from wildlife going down to wildlife going up? Now, the best thing we've done is reintroduce beavers, right? By far. Because that's created habitat. It's literally robbed some people of land because they've burrowed into a bankside, taken a bit of land from a farmer and made it into a beautiful nature reserve for free. So that's essentially the real battle of life, is about land.
Would
Who's
you
going
like?
to use it and
Yeah,
occupy it, and how much pressure is on that land for human needs or wildlife needs?
fantastic. Would you like to speak a little bit to exactly what beavers do? I mean, I've read quite a bit about beavers, and it really is quite
Yeah.
remarkable the effect they have.
So this was a thing that grabbed a hold of me as a very young, um, not even before I became a naturalist, when I was still at university, reading Grial and his early ecological observations about Canadian beavers in the Canadian wilderness and people trapping them and making them virtually extinct, and how that affected the whole system of water. So what people don't realize is once beaver affected 25% of the whole of Britain, if not 30%, because they turned rivers into vast wetland systems, damming and all this kind of stuff. And we're not talking about giant dams, we're talking about lots of dams. Even in estuaries, beavers can trap fresh water in little areas. And so beavers occupy space, they re-wet it, they fix the hydrology, and then they'll stop there and they'll leave. So you get all these successions of wetlands and then drying out with all the different creatures. And they obviously chop down trees, but not all of them. One of the other things, that I loved with early reading was Coppice Like a Beaver, because anyway, beavers create these fantastic wetlands. Coppicing like a beaver was another little observation by it was the I'll remember his name at the moment. It was the Queen's Forester who did Windsor Great Park. Fantastic chap. He learned about trees, but he said we're coppicing by getting chainsaws and chopping trees right off at the bottom to create a bit of coppice, or some rare butterfly can live, or this rare orchid on the nature reserve. So and then you're burning the stuff. And he said if you coppice like a beaver, you're going to coppice the stool higher up. You might leave one of the poles, one of the tree branches up there. So you create diversity. By doing that, the tree gets less stressed, less likely to die. People are burning stuff on nature reserves, which is causing injury to root systems, which is really important to allow disease in. So he put all these fantastic things, why beaver are the way to naturally manage woodlands and wetlands. And they do it all themselves. Man doesn't have to do a thing. And that's why beavers are wonderful. So they bring back massive biodiversity.
I saw, I think it was a few months ago now, that Boris Johnson bought his father some beavers for his estate.
Yes, I do know about that, but I don't want to talk about privileged information. Okay. But I know let's just say that I know Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley, who's been a huge supporter of our beaver work for many years, and through some other people who I'm not at liberty to say, Boris Johnson was, well, let's just say that somebody else did it and he gave the nod. But Stanley's been, remember, Stanley Johnson wrote the Habitats Directive.
Yeah.
He was in the Habitats Directive was a fantastic. Now, 20 years ago, I actually had a speaking engagement with Stanley, and he told me this fascinating story. Do you know why the Habitats Directive was such a good piece of wildlife legislation? Far better than anything we had in the UK at the time. It's because he put it on these little Amstrad word processor discs that nobody had. And I remember having one of those early word processors, and they were a different format. So when he sent it for consultation to all the member governments, none of them could read it. So all their lawyers couldn't put the weasel words in that makes the legislation totally ineffective. And therefore it passed with all that stuff on environmental impact assessment, having your various forms of protected species, and it wasn't modified by government bureaucrats and lawyers to detooth it, which meant that in that legislation allowed beavers to come back in many ways. It throughout Europe, there was a fantastic piece of legislation. So he's a hero. But Stanley Johnson is probably the man to do more for wildlife in Europe than anybody else. And it's nice that in his dotage, he's got some beavers to put on his land. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Fantastic. One of the reasons I brought that up was thinking, do you have any faith in sort of the political class?
None at all. Right. It's not, when you study political science, which I know you're interested in, you've got to look at what, one of the greatest quotes is, asking a politician to do something is like asking the manager of a McDonald's to change the menu.
Right, so it's more the system overall rather than
because if they do make any positive changes, they'll be removed. Right. There is a selectorate. The people who select who gets to go into power are, and it's not like there's some kind of cabal with smoke-filled rooms with with dark, evil people. It's just the natural process of people making decisions for self-advantage. And that tendency, now I know there's some wonderful people in this government who really support rewilding, and some of the top people, Boris, Gove, the Goldsmith brothers, all those people, totally into rewilding. They're utter, evangelical converts for this. But how are you going to change the process by which people derive their wealth from land? And the whole history of all politics, doesn't matter British, is, as Parnell said, the history of politics has always been about who owns the land and how they derive income from the land. And that's been a battle that's been going on for thousands of years. It's all about that. And essentially what we're seeing here is who owns the right to earn income from the destruction of nature. That's another reframing of that same thing. So while I think this government is going to do some wonderful things to allow certain projects, they give them big funding so their mates with country estates can rewild them, and I'm perfectly happy for that. But I don't think we're ever going to tackle the real farming issues, right? Where we can make, because I think of it as an economist would think it. What we need is a politics that will fundamentally change the rules of how people earn money from the destruction of wildlife.
Right.
That's the only way we can make a real change. And the current political setup is not ready to tackle, and that means any side of it. The politics, I don't care whether you're whatever political party, they're all charlatans, and now and again you get a chance to do something good, whether they're Tory, Liberal, or Labour. It was a Labour minister who gave us the go-ahead over his all of his advisors and to allow the Beavers first out at Ham Fen. It was Michael Meacher, who we went to a meeting and he just listened to the arguments and told his civil servants to get knotted and allow us to do it, because a lot of them were dead set against it. But now we've got really good projects which are happening under Tories. So I don't think wildlife is a political argument. It's whether you can. At the moment, we have to get somebody with power to make a little decision to help wildlife a little bit. What I want to do is to get politicians to make decisions that'll make us all want to protect wildlife, whether we want to or not.
There's the Chinese. They have their sort of 5-year plans and then 10-year plans. I think they even have like 100-year plans and 200-year plans. You've just illustrated there what sort of most people know in the UK is that politics. I think they sort of number 10 doesn't plan more than 10 days ahead or something like that.
There's no plan.
And obviously, in terms of environmentalism, we're talking about generations here. And I'm not sort of saying we should move to a Chinese model or anything like that.
Oh, far from it.
But how might we, and also not going the other way in making a sort of, we should move to, towards monarchy or anything like that. But how might we sort of build into the system this kind of more, or perhaps it's what you just demonstrated. How might we build into the system this kind of sense of longevity and, we're not thinking, maybe it's also part of sort of modernity and our kind of, immediate gratification culture, but how can we sort of reclaim that sort of, long-term intergenerational responsibility, do you think?
Well, we have to take decisions out of the hands of people. The problem is we're giving decisions to a few people when really decisions should have a much broader base of expertise and knowledge and stuff like that. But really, we want to start taking decisions away from, I'm going to fund this work. So a politician sits there, well, I can go and put 150 million quid to this grant program to allow rewilding. That makes no difference. 150 million quid's a drop in the ocean. You can't fund the protection of wildlife. That's mad. Anybody who actually really thinks about it will understand that the many hundreds of millions of pounds, 400 million, 500 million pounds that are at the disposal of wildlife charities and government programs are not making a dicky bird's difference. You know, they are saving some, but they're not stopping the loss of biodiversity. The only way we can do it, and if we were talking about Chinese, the um, the wonderful Chinese politician Sun Yat-sen, who I urge you to read, had this solution. So the founder of China, and we're talking both communist China and Taiwan, because he was the spiritual founder of both systems. He is neither left nor right. We can look at the great Henry George. Some of the greatest minds in history have all understood that what we need is a force that slowly moves everybody to conserve nature and to protect people from monopoly practices where people are earning money by destroying nature or just mere ownership of something, right? And that means we need to make it more expensive to destroy wildlife and less expensive to do activities and earn money that aren't destroying wildlife or using land.
Do you think that there's a sort of underpinning ideological gap there? Like, I mean, we spoke about metaphysics before. Do you think that's that sort of that force, as you say, could be sort of grounded in a sort of new metaphysics? I don't know. I don't want to get too kind of
Well, I
deep
mean,
in the, you know.
metaphysics just means trying to understand something that our poor little human brain don't really grab a hold of. You know, I often say to people when describing our ability to understand the world around us, we are like worms looking at a television, you know, Coronation Street on the television, with no ears to hear, no eyes to see, no brain to understand, because the world is complicated. And I have spent my life studying those tiny interactions between nature, and even I am just a worm. I'm just a little bit better educated worm than other people. And when we come to politics and human interactions, so the real fundamental problem, I think, is this issue of self-advantage, right? People making decisions for their own benefit, where they get a bit of extra cash, they get a bit of an easier system than other people, and that's to do with what Darwin talked about. You know, we have individual selection and we have group selection, and we forget that group selection is by far the most powerful force in human endeavor. It is the groups that we form and how we identify with the people around us, and then how we seek self-advantage is the fundamental problem, and we need fundamental systems to take that group self-advantage away and to make the group both nature and all of people. And that doesn't mean communism, because I think, you know, you've got to understand that even in communism you had a free market. Even communism, you had environmental destruction on a massive scale because people were making decisions again for immediate self-advantage of party officials, commissars, whatever. You need a system that suppresses that tendency for humans to exploit nature. And the only way I think you can do that is just taxing. Stop taxing people's wages, VAT, and change it to a simple, you tax land, the land values, because that's a monopoly, and you tax destructive things like pesticides, oil use, carbon, all that, not in the rubbish way we're doing it at the moment, where we're giving carbon credits, so we're just effectively creating carbon monopolists of the future. But we just put a base tax, and this works. The Tories have already done this. The landfill tax was one of the finest bits of legislation we had many moons ago. It suppressed, when you tax, you know, rubbish going into tip, you actually reduce it. It puts a cost. It's far better to put that tax at the start of the process than the end. So if we tax oil, we have more efficient cars. We look for other issues. If we start funding, say we're going to fund a wind turbine, you'll find out there's loads of fraud. And I know lots of fraud. One of my mates is an academic in wind turbines, and there's all kinds of fraud where you get grants. Forget about grants. Just tax oil use, then you'll get the most efficient wind turbines, the most efficient solar cells. But you're taxing the bad things that go to make them, so people will use their natural ingenious, harness humanity's positivity, our genius, our drive to do things, instead of our drive to own and control, right, which is untaxed, so we get richer and richer people owning more and more assets, monopoly assets, we need to tax the environmental destructive forces, and that allows people to work out themselves how to use resources less, how to use land less. And of course, that shifts the margin. So the other topic we have to do is what's the margin at which we use things like land, or whether we pump oil out of the ground and put it in the atmosphere. We need to shift that margin down. And that means if we tax that, the margin goes down, so more land is rewilded. It will come to a point where lander says, oh, sod it, I'm just going to leave this. And the best thing to do is that it rewilds. And the guy pumping the oil out of the ground says, I don't want to pump anymore because it's costing me more money than it is worth it. So we're going to pump less, and then we're going to find ways to make more fuel efficient houses, cars, all that, just by taxing. So it's having that force pressing down on our abusive nature.
Are you optimistic?
No, because humans have never done that. The history of humans is to be taxing nature less. And, you know, if you go back in our history, we actually had a system of land value and monopoly taxes. It was called hidage under the Anglo-Saxons. It made Britain into the most economically advanced country in the world at the time. We had the highest standard of living because we taxed land based on the land's productivity.
So Anglo-Saxon, you said?
Anglo-Saxon.
So this is what, like 1,000 years ago? 1,100?
Yeah.
More or less around there?
Yeah. So we're talking, 1,200, 1,100
So can you talk a little bit more about hidage?
Well, hidage is a system whereby a thane, a local, you know, people would live in villages.
Chieftain.
Chieftain, thanes, right? And the king would say, your land can produce X amount of value, and you can provide that either in money or in troops for the army, right? For when we need to fight. And if you start off, you can see that under that system, the rental value of land is a good way to describe it, the unimproved land, made up all our taxations. That means nobody got taxed for actually doing productive work, right? You know, learning how to make swords, anything that wasn't taxed. It was just the tax of the land. It didn't go to the thane. Yeah, he had a nice big house. You know, he had nicer stuff, but he didn't monopolize that for himself. It went to provide public services, which is security, law, all that kind of stuff. But since that time, all the taxes on monopoly have reduced and been replaced by taxes on productivity, right? That means land becomes cheaper to abuse, but much more expensive to acquire. So that means land values go up and up and up, and that's what's happening in the economy at the moment. Where you have high land price, we're seeing that with forestry. We are trying to grab a bit of monopoly for ourselves, but in grabbing that monopoly, we're going to use it to the nth degree. So I don't have a happy tale to tell for the future on overall economic processes until we put real costs onto people who abuse nature.
Peter, I think that's a nice place to stop. Where can people find you and your work if they're looking for you, social media?
I do some, yes, I do. I've got a website, Peter Smith Rewilding. Just type that in. I'm doing some really cracking projects, but unfortunately, I've had to sign NDAs about them at the moment. So they're amazing projects. So there's some fantastic ideas around on big rewilding around the world. You know, huge. But I can't talk about them, which is really annoying because they're really exciting. But I'm happy to give advice if anybody wants to, and free. I give advice to lots of various rewilding projects, and happy to do it for free. And if you've got a commercial project, you can talk to me about a commercial relationship. But really, I'm not in this for the money. And the other things I'm doing is I'm making some documentaries. So I do a lot of filming and photography, which is what's my hobby.
We'll have to have you back and talk about those and maybe a little showcase what you've been up to. Peter, thank you.
Thank you.